Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to join you, albeit in circumstances none of us could foresee 6 months ago. My name is Michael Barrett, and I have been OTA's National Manager of Government and Stakeholder Relations since December 2016. May I first acknowledge the original custodians of the land on which we meet today, wherever you happen to be on this ancient continent. I speak to you from Melbourne, home of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to their elders, past and present. When I joined OTA, the National Disability Insurance Scheme had commenced its national rollout a few months earlier on the 1st of July 2016. I think it's fair to say that at that time, the scheme's problems overshadowed its great promise. Telephone calls and emails from providers and carers to the NDIA went unacknowledged for weeks, even months. Wait times for eligibility to be determined were too long. Wait times for initial plan meetings were too long. Wait times for plan reviews were too long. And of course, these wait times left highly vulnerable people without necessary supports, exposing them to unacceptable risks. Even with plans in place, too often the wait for assistive technology was too long, denying participants the support they needed to achieve their goals. Correct me if I'm wrong, and at the end of this presentation I will give you my email address so you can do just that, but it seems things are slowly getting better. We at OTA are certainly receiving fewer complaints about the time it takes to hear back from the NDIA. This may be due to an NDIS website that is gradually improving, with more information online ensuring fewer inquiries need to be directed to the agency. These positive developments notwithstanding, it is still fair, I think, to entitle this presentation The NDIS at Age 4, Promise and Problems. It was a cause for great relief late last year, after lengthy advocacy efforts, when Australia's 9 governments agreed to amend NDIS provider registration rules, which had hitherto placed a disproportionate regulatory burden on some NDIS providers, particularly small businesses delivering lower risk supports such as therapies, home modifications, and specialist equipment. Specifically, such providers would no longer have to undergo the NDIS Quality and Safeguard Commission certification process, including an unreasonably expensive audit, simply because they were an incorporated entity. These changes took effect from the 1st of January this year. This significant win notwithstanding, OTA remains concerned that one arm of government, the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency, or AHPRA, can deem an occupational therapist fit to practice, while another, the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, calls that fitness into question and expects you to spend considerable time and money persuading them otherwise. As we put it recently in our submission to the Australian Parliament's inquiry into the Commission, quote, to become a registered occupational therapist, an individual must complete an accredited undergraduate degree and meet all registration requirements set by AHPRA. These requirements cover criminal history, English language skills, professional indemnity and insurance arrangements, continuing professional development, and recency of practice. Occupational therapists must also renew their registration annually and demonstrate that they continue to meet the board's registration standards. Imposing any additional screening or registration requirements on occupational therapists simply duplicates regulatory functions. Such duplication is not only unnecessary, it has the demonstrated effect of disrupting workforce attraction and retention. Why then must the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission impose an additional and very expensive layer of bureaucracy on top of AHPRA registration? This is akin to issuing someone a driver's license, but then imposing an additional licensing process if that person wishes to drive down a particular street. Certification and verification of AHPRA registered service providers by the Commission is unnecessary. It is onerous. It is expensive. Worse, it drives talented clinicians from NDIS work, depriving NDIS participants of enhanced choice of service providers, supposedly a tenet of the scheme, unquote. Those practitioners who, because of the nature of the supports they provide, still have to undergo certification by the Commission, face a considerable regulatory burden and expensive audit. In our submission to the parliamentary inquiry, OTA noted the narrowing of the audit requirement from the 1st of January, but said, quote, "This welcome development notwithstanding, the fact remains that the audit is unnecessarily expensive, a fact attributable in part to the limited number of approved auditors. Despite repeated assurances by the Commission, the number of approved auditors has not increased over the past 18 months. In fact, it seems to have been cut from 16 to 15. While these firms claim to provide services across all of Australia, they are all metropolitan based, meaning that NDIS providers based in regional and rural parts of the country must bear the additional cost of the visiting auditors' travel and accommodation. If OTA is incorrect about this, and measures have been taken to address this injustice, we would be delighted to hear it. We urge the Joint Standing Committee to inquire into this particular matter, given that thin provider markets in regional and rural Australia will never be meaningfully addressed if there are institutionalised disincentives to practising in these areas. The Commission's panel of approved auditors is anti-competitive, and this is reflected in the still excessive cost of a certification audit. As such, the existing arrangement is a reason for occupational therapists not to pursue certification by the Commission. Accordingly, OTA asks the Joint Standing Committee to request data from the NDIA or the Commission around the number of NDIS service providers who have chosen not to re-register, the number of NDIS service providers who are instead providing services in an unregistered capacity, and the number of self-managed and plan-managed participants, and whether this figure has grown since the establishment of the Commission, unquote. OTA will continue to question the need for the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission to oversee, let alone regulate, the work of those allied health professionals registered by AHPRA. I turn now to the NDIS schedule of fees. OTA was concerned to note that there was no increase in the fees paid to providers in this year's schedule of NDIS fees, not even an increase in line with the rise in the Consumer Price Index. This was not flagged during the annual price review. Moreover, informal advice since the announcement is that we should not expect any increase next year. And that was before the COVID-19 pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, whether you work in the NDIS or not, it is important to understand that governments across the globe are running up deficits unimaginable since World War II. Money is going to be tight for decades to come. No area of public policy will be spared, irrespective of which party forms government. We should not expect services for the disabled to be quarantined from these budgetary realities. Having said that, OTA will continue to advocate for increases in line with the cost of living to ensure members working within the scheme do not find themselves slipping backwards. I turn now to the vexed issue of NDIS independent assessments. On Friday the 28th of August, the Minister for the NDIS, the Honourable Stuart Roberts MP, announced several changes to existing arrangements. These included the release of a new Participant Service Charter and Participant Service Improvement Plan, which set out how the NDIA will deliver on the Participant Service Guarantee. These reforms set new service standards and clearer timeframes for decision-making by the NDIA. While these reforms are welcome and in line with the recommendations of the review of the scheme conducted by Mr. David Tune, one new reform is of considerable concern to OTA members. This is the rollout of new independent assessments, which will help determine eligibility for the scheme. In his media release, the Minister said independent assessments will deliver a simpler, faster and fairer approach for determining a person's eligibility, right through to developing more flexible and equitable support packages. Very significantly, this was not a recommendation of the Tune Review. Also significantly, the rollout of the assessments was announced before training modules for the assessments had been finalised, and without the release of the pilot project research and results which informed the development of the tool. For the last couple of months, OTA has been a member of a working group commissioned by the NDIA and led by Allied Health Professions Australia, or AHPA, charged with developing the training modules to enable select allied health professionals to become independent assessors for the NDIA, thereby helping improve access to the scheme. I am advised that the work of that group is not yet complete. We appreciate the need to improve access to the scheme and are aware that this is the ultimate driver for the development of the eligibility screening model. But it is unclear how the proposed scheme will achieve this. OTA's concerns are around the relevance and scope of the proposed eligibility scheme, what the experience will be like for consumers, the process for determining eligibility, and the effectiveness of the tools being used to determine eligibility. Such were OTA's concerns about these proposed amendments. We were drafting a letter to the CEO of the NDIA about them when the Minister issued his media release. Accordingly, the letter was instead addressed to the Minister and was sent on the 31st of August. As a result of that correspondence, our CEO, Sam Hunter, met with a senior official at the NDIA last Tuesday to voice the considerable concerns of our membership. It appears the role of independent assessor will be to conduct a suite of stipulated clinician measurement tools and a systematic observation of a participant carrying out a functional task to determine their eligibility for the scheme. The NDIA has chosen 6 allied health professional groups to be trained in the independent assessor role. They are occupational therapy, physiotherapy, psychology, rehabilitation counsellors, social workers, and speech pathology. Each allied health professional group, of course, has a distinct role in the NDIA and operates out of a distinctly different scope of practice. Accordingly, the training modules are aimed at developing general competencies. It is unclear, however, how the eligibility screening process will improve access to the NDIS. Rather, it involves a layer of screening that will likely exclude many potential participants from the scheme before a proper assessment has been conducted. OTA has 3 major concerns that have not yet been addressed by the NDIA. First is the use and interpretation of functional assessments by professionals not trained to functionally assess clients carrying out occupational activities and tasks. While we have been reassured that it is an eligibility screening process, the NDIA continues to use terminology pertaining to functional assessment, a practice that misleads all stakeholders. Functional assessments, as occupational therapists know them, require a distinct skill set that is core to occupational therapy practice. They cease to be a reliable or valid means of assessment if used by other professional groups in the diminished way currently proposed by the NDIA. Observation of a participant carrying out a task cannot be reliably interpreted as a valid method for determining functional capacity unless the independent assessor is a qualified occupational therapist using specific professional reasoning, detailed task analysis, risk management, and assessment tools. Second, how useful, reliable, and valid are the proposed tools in determining eligibility? And third, how effective is the independent assessment for individuals? There are 2 possible outcomes which give rise to concern. The first is that the assessments will be perfunctory, with the focus on throughput rather than clinical decision-making. By all means, facilitate the process of determining eligibility for the scheme, but not by means of a flawed tool. As one OTA member remarked after the Minister's announcement, How can a complex functional assessment be completed appropriately and in enough depth to inform plan funding in 1 to 4 hours with only a minimum of 20 minutes of observation as per the tender documentation? The other possibility of concern is that the proposed assessments will in fact prove a barrier to accessing the NDIS. The eligibility screen involves standard procedures being carried out in an objective and impersonal way, which is likely to prove daunting for many applicants. We are concerned that an individual applying for access to the NDIS will find the proposed eligibility screen very onerous and time-consuming. There seems to be little focus on getting to know the person and identifying their needs. Cognitive and psychosocial issues are poorly addressed in the battery of tools being proposed. This is particularly concerning given the great difficulty clients with mental health issues have had accessing the scheme to date. Several members have questioned the appropriateness of independent assessment of those clients with rare or complex disabilities and those with psychosocial disability. Mental Health Australia, of which OTA is a member association, has expressed concern that the measurement tools proposed are not appropriate for psychosocial assessment. I am pleased to report that consumer groups in the mental health space have also been advocating on this issue. They are concerned about the mandatory nature of the proposed assessments and the fact that highly vulnerable people will be assessed by complete strangers rather than the health professional they have come to know and to trust. And of course, how can the often episodic and fluctuating nature of mental illness be assessed in the context of a one-off engagement lasting 1 to 4 hours and with as little as 20 minutes of clinical observation? Perhaps of greatest concern is the fact that the person who will make the final determination as to a person's eligibility for the scheme will be an NDIA delegate without even the training of an independent assessor. So, an allied health professional will be expected to conduct an assessment using the generalist tools developed, but not drawing on their years of clinical experience or their powers of clinical reasoning, in effect, ticking boxes. That person will then forward the raw data to an NDIA delegate who may or may not be a clinician. The NDIA does not intend sharing that detail, nor even the percentage of NDIA delegates who are clinicians. The NDIA delegate, who may have no clinical background and who has had no particular training, will then decide whether the client is eligible for the scheme, basing their decision on data collected from tools not designed for the use and without knowing or seeing the client. Is that ideal? Is that in the spirit of a scheme which is supposed to represent world's best practice in disability support and which the Productivity Commission estimates will ultimately cost about $22 billion a year? We are also gravely concerned that the independent assessment model itself, as distinct from the training modules that will support it, was developed and put out to tender by the NDIA without any consultation, as a fait accompli. Certainly, OTA and ARPA were not consulted. Let me repeat, for the record, OTA was not consulted about the actual independent assessment model itself, which is quite astonishing. Moreover, important data relating to a pilot of the independent assessment model has not been released by the NDIA, despite freedom of information requests. OTA's basic concern is this: the independent assessment is in fact a screening device and its tools are unsuited to an assessment. That's fine, as long as it serves merely as a basic test of a person's eligibility for the NDIS. Now, however, we learn that this incorrectly labelled assessment will inform the participant's plan. That is clinically unsound. If the NDIA believes otherwise, it should release all data from the pilot. OTA is concerned that while a number of these issues have been elevated to the NDIA during the project, there has been no indication that these matters have been addressed, let alone satisfactorily resolved. Given these outstanding concerns, it is unsurprising that the Minister's announcement of the assessments was light on detail. OTA also notes concerns about the future of those smaller OT practices which have been involved in assessment processes to date and might lose that work as a result of the proposed reforms. What we do not want is a panel of approved providers, as all too often these comprise a few large, impersonal, multinational companies. And all too often, such arrangements, while bureaucratically convenient, result in the termination of long-standing and hugely beneficial clinical relationships between highly experienced clinicians working in small practices with often very complex clients. This matter has been raised explicitly with the Minister. OTA suggests an alternative model. This would involve a preliminary interview carried out by an independent assessor to identify the client's concerns, needs, and goals. An independent assessor with appropriate training could carry out these preliminary interviews, gathering information and referring the client on for an appropriate assessment by clinicians working within their scope of practice. When functional assessments of a person's occupational performance are deemed necessary, we would obviously and strongly recommend referrals specifically to an occupational therapist. Occupational therapists are uniquely qualified to conduct assessments to determine a client's ability to effectively and safely carry out activities and tasks they want and need to do, and to determine their ability to participate in productive occupations and social and community activities. This model would provide a roadmap for improving the outcome of clients with a disability, which is core to the intent and spirit of the NDIS. I am pleased to report that last week both the CEO and I attended meetings with the NDIA, and these meetings were positive in tone and substantively proactive. We will continue to progress these discussions and voice our concerns. We understand that promising news is on the immediate horizon, and be assured we will continue to update you as soon as we receive news. We have fiercely lobbied the NDIA around our concerns regarding the functional capacity assessment framework. We know that it is not a functional assessment framework. It is at best a screening tool, and if it were a functional assessment, it would fall strictly within an occupational therapist's scope of practice, not a generalist's. Having said that, it remains a clinically flawed tool, something we will continue to draw to the attention of the NDIA. While they may persist with the tool, and we will advocate for improvements to it, OTA remains steadfast in our view that this tool requires renaming. We are hopeful that we have been heard on this point and look forward to a positive outcome soon. OTA will continue to lobby vigorously in this space, both as an independent association with issues specific to our profession and in conjunction with ARPA to project a multidisciplinary allied health voice. We will, of course, keep members informed of developments. I turn now to NDIS support coordinators. The NDIA has recently commenced a review of its support coordination service model, and OTA has lodged a written submission as part of that process. Interestingly, our call for feedback from members elicited a considerable response, much of it detailed and impassioned. I think it's fair to say this constitutes another of the scheme's problems. With regard to how support coordination should interact with other NDIS supports and mainstream services, OTA believes the role should be to work with the participant to engage the supports that are necessary to achieve their goals, while respecting the participant's right to choice and control. It requires someone who can guide without being prescriptive, and at no time should the support coordinator presume to dictate the clinical approach taken by appropriately qualified service providers. While there is sometimes a need for support coordinators, it is incongruous that the budget for them can be greater than the therapeutic capacity building budget. There is also a lack of accountability around the support coordinator's budget, and this constitutes a double standard. As one OTA member noted, support coordinators will bill for all communication, yet if a therapist bills a participant for contacting suppliers to organise trials or for communicating with the support coordinator, the support coordinator will often tell a participant not to pay and that they are being ripped off, unquote. There is serious concern among OTA members about directives or service requests coming from support coordinators. Another member wrote, "Many support coordinators will instruct or tell a therapist what the participant needs, rather than enabling the occupational therapist to complete an unbiased, objective assessment of goals, function, and need. Occupational therapists are often castigated if they do not do what the coordinator has stated," unquote. This is clearly an unacceptable practice, given that occupational therapists working in the NDIS have university qualifications in their area of expertise and are duly registered by and answerable to AHPRA. In contrast, as the NDIA's discussion paper itself notes, support coordinators do not generally have to hold any particular qualification to undertake their role, and there are no specific measures or outcomes expected to demonstrate quality service. Such a state of affairs clearly undermines one of the scheme's 5 fundamental objectives, as stated in the National Disability Insurance Scheme Act 2013, quote, "promoting the provision of high quality and innovative supports to people with disability." Moreover, this can have a decisive effect on the viability of businesses trying to operate within the NDIS. Significantly, the discussion paper's section on conflict of interest elicited numerous comments from OTA members, notably around the capacity for support coordinators to play favourites and deny work to providers whom they consider difficult. As a result of this attitude, some support coordinators have disrupted long-standing and highly beneficial clinical relationships or disengaged participants from promising therapeutic relationships upon their appointment. OTA members report that support coordinators often fail to discuss goals and funding budgets with participants. This results in an inordinate number of therapists having to operate within an unrealistically small budget, a state of affairs that cannot, under most circumstances, be expected to deliver an outcome. OTA is concerned that there is a lack of training for support coordinators and too few stated expectations to guide the performance of the role. What and where are the outcome measures for support coordinators? The apparent absence of KPIs encourages case management style services, which ensures that the support coordination role continues to be required when perhaps it is not. Finally, while there may be a limited advocacy role in support coordination, it is imperative that this not be confused with a right to be directive towards those providing clinical supports. Support coordinators should not lobby, let alone seek to dictate to appropriately qualified clinicians. Please be assured, our submission to the review is not relentlessly critical. It notes the positive role that support coordinators should and sometimes do play, and it includes a list of recommendations that could add value to the role. And in that vein, let me conclude by saying that OTA is not relentlessly critical of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It promises much for Australians with disability, and many thousands already lead much richer lives because of it. You, much more than me, have seen what a transformative scheme it can be for participants when it works. In some ways, it is a victim of its own success. An enduring problem for the scheme's participants is the thin provider markets that exist between our capital cities. But the NDIS has itself contributed to this problem by establishing reliable sources of work for providers in private practice in our cities and regional centres, removing any incentive to work in remote areas. May I take this opportunity to acknowledge the work of OTA's NDIS National Reference Group. This group of immensely experienced OTs serves to bring the concerns of OTA members working in the NDIS and their clients to the attention of OTA. It also informs our policy development around the NDIS and plays a key role in our written submissions to government and government agencies. As I indicated earlier, I would be happy to hear your views on any of the issues I have raised this morning, and particularly on my comment that it appears that engagement with the NDIA has become less necessary and more timely over the last 12 months. My email address is policy@otaus.com.au.